Jake Harris tightened his fishing line as the heavy summer air clung to his skin. The sun had slipped below the trees, leaving the sky painted with streaks of purple and gold. Beside him, his cousin Tommy Wilson tossed their gear into the back of Jake's old pickup truck, humming a tune as he worked. The boys were restless, eager to spend a warm July night at Perdido Creek. Jake slid behind the wheel, the fabric of the worn seat creaking under his weight. Tommy jumped in on the passenger side, a grin spread across his face. With a rumble of the engine, the truck rolled down the narrow dirt road that cut through thick pine woods. Headlights carved pale beams across the path ahead. The two cousins had made this trip countless times before, but this night would be different. By the time they reached the creek, night had taken full control. The chorus of crickets and frogs filled the air, broken only by the splash of water against rocks. Jake parked close to the bank, leaving the headlights on to guide their way. They unloaded rods, tackle boxes, and a small cooler of sodas. Tommy joked that the fish would not stand a chance against them tonight. They moved with ease, their footsteps pressing into soft mud. Jake cast his line first, the lure vanishing into the dark water with a quiet ripple. Tommy followed, his laughter echoing across the creek. For a while, the world seemed still, just two teenagers wrapped in the rhythm of summer and friendship. But somewhere beyond the shadows of the trees, another presence lingered. The woods held secrets that night, and silence seemed to grow heavier as time passed. Around midnight, the cousins' voices faded from the ears of anyone who might have been near. What happened between those hours remains unclear. But what is known is this: Jake and Tommy never returned home. When dawn broke over Baldwin County, the stillness of Perdido Creek revealed a scene that was both ordinary and haunting. Jake's truck sat abandoned on the bank, its headlights dim, still faintly glowing after a long night. The doors were closed, but the driver's window was partly rolled down, as if left in haste. Near the truck, fishing gear was scattered in the mud. One rod leaned awkwardly against the bumper, the reel tangled and wet. A tackle box lay overturned, hooks and lures glinting in the pale morning light. A single soda can rested on its side, its contents spilled into the dirt. There was no sign of Jake, no sign of Tommy. The first passerby, an older man heading out early to fish, slowed his vehicle when he noticed the abandoned truck. Stepping out, he called into the trees, expecting to see two boys stumble back, tired after a long night. No voices answered. He walked closer, uneasy as he saw the scattered gear. After a few minutes of searching, he drove quickly to the nearest gas station and called the sheriff's office. Deputies arrived shortly after sunrise. They examined the truck, peered into the creek, and scanned the edges of the woods. Their radios crackled as they reported back to Sheriff Harold Bennett. Something was wrong, very wrong. By late morning, the area was swarming with officers and volunteers. They shouted the boys' names, their voices echoing through the pines. But the only reply came from the wind rustling leaves and the steady flow of water. The truck stood as a silent witness, headlights flickering weakly until the battery gave out. The scattered gear told a story of sudden interruption. Yet the boys themselves were gone, as if swallowed by the night. That July morning in 1995 marked the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Alabama for decades. And as investigators took their first steps into the case, no one could have imagined how long the truth would remain buried. Jake Harris was 16 years old, tall for his age, with sandy blonde hair that curled slightly over his forehead. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, the kind that came from long afternoons spent on the baseball field. Friends described him as steady, thoughtful, and dependable. When he was not playing baseball, he was usually fishing, a passion he had inherited from his grandfather. The stillness of the creek was his escape, a place where the noise of teenage life faded into calm water and open sky. Tommy Wilson, only a year younger, was Jake's opposite in nearly every way. At 15, he was sharp-tongued and quick to laugh, always ready with a joke or a clever remark. His dark hair framed a face that often carried a mischievous grin. Where Jake preferred quiet focus, Tommy thrived in noise and energy. But beneath his playful nature was a loyalty that ran deep. He admired his older cousin and followed him everywhere, never letting distance or difference weaken their bond. The cousins grew up only a few miles apart in Baldwin County, Alabama. Their families were close, gathering for Sunday dinners and church events. For Jake and Tommy, summers meant freedom. They spent their days swimming in creeks, tossing baseballs in open fields, and taking Jake's old truck down dusty back roads with fishing poles rattling in the back. It was a rhythm of small-town life, steady and familiar, a world where trouble seemed far away. At school, Jake was known as a reliable student. Teachers saw him as polite and hardworking, never causing disruptions. His teammates respected him for his discipline on the baseball field, where he played second base with a calm focus. He dreamed of one day attending college, maybe even playing ball beyond high school. Tommy was different in the classroom. He had little patience for long lessons, often making his classmates laugh with whispered jokes when the teacher turned away. Still, he carried a charm that softened his mischief. He could brighten a room with his humor, and his friends often turned to him when they needed someone to lift their spirits. He dreamed less about college and more about adventure, maybe traveling, maybe working outdoors, but always doing something exciting. Despite their differences, the cousins were inseparable. Jake's steadiness balanced Tommy's energy, and Tommy's humor pulled Jake out of his quiet shell. Together, they were stronger, braver, and happier. They were not just cousins, they were best friends. That summer of 1995 was supposed to be like every other. Baseball games in the heat, fishing trips at the creek, long evenings with friends, and the promise of more freedom as they grew older. For their families, it was a season of ordinary joys. Watching the boys grow, hearing their laughter echo across backyards, and believing that the future stretched wide open before them. But that promise was broken. What began as a simple fishing trip turned into a night that stole their youth, their futures, and left a silence that no family gathering could ever fill again. Their innocence, their bond, their lives, all interrupted in a single night. And with their disappearance, Baldwin County would never be the same. On the evening of July 14, 1995, the Alabama heat clung to every surface, heavy and unrelenting. Jake Harris and Tommy Wilson had loaded their fishing gear into the back of Jake's worn pickup truck. The boys left home just before dusk, their voices filled with excitement of another night at Perdido Creek. As they passed through the narrow county roads, the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires marked their journey. A neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, noticed them as she watered her garden. She waved as the truck rolled by, Jake behind the wheel and Tommy leaning out of the passenger window with a grin. That brief encounter would make her the last confirmed person to see the cousins alive. The dirt road wound deep into the pines before opening to the slow-moving creek. The boys parked on the bank, headlights cutting into the dark as the sky shifted from fading orange to black. The truck door slammed, cooler lids clicked, and the faint glow of cigarette lighters could be seen as they prepared their gear. It was the kind of night they knew well, yet something in the air felt unsettled, almost too quiet. By midnight, no one heard their voices again. What unfolded during those hours has never been fully known, but the clues left behind painted a picture of sudden interruption. At dawn, the creek revealed a scene both ordinary and terrifying. The truck sat on the edge of the bank, headlights weak, the battery nearly drained. Its tires were pressed deep into the mud, as if it had been parked in haste. The driver's window was half rolled down. On the passenger side, a soda can rested on its side in the dirt, its contents spilled and darkened into the soil. Near the rear bumper, a fishing rod leaned crookedly, the reel tangled and damp. Just a few feet away, a tackle box lay overturned, its metal lid bent and lures scattered like broken pieces of glass across the mud. Hooks glistened on the first touch of sunlight. Muddy footprints, small and uneven, trailed from the truck toward the edge of the water. Some prints overlapped, others disappeared entirely into the shallow creek bed. The river current erased their ending, leaving nothing but silence. When the first passerby, an older fisherman named Paul McKinney, approached the scene, he was struck by the unease of it all. He had come to the creek for an early catch, but found himself staring at an abandoned truck instead. Calling out for the boys brought no answer. After minutes of hesitation, he drove to the nearest phone booth and reported the discovery to the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office. Deputies arrived quickly. They circled the truck, examining every detail. They noted the fishing gear, the soda can, and the footprints fading into the water. Radios crackled with instructions as the scene grew tense. Sheriff Harold Bennett, a seasoned officer, ordered the area sealed and searches launched in every direction. By mid-morning, the creek banks were crowded. Volunteers, family members, and officers combed through the woods, calling Jake's and Tommy's names. Boats searched the water, while divers plunged beneath the current, searching for any sign of the cousins. Helicopters cut across the sky, their blades stirring the trees. But the search brought nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no clear evidence of a struggle. The gear scattered in the mud was all that remained, like fragments of a story cut short. The symbolism of the scene weighed heavily on everyone who witnessed it. The overturned tackle box felt like a frozen moment of chaos. The footprints leading into water spoke of vanishing without return. And the soda can, left unfinished, was a silent reminder of the boys' last simple act before something went terribly wrong. Hours stretched into evening. Families gathered near the search site, their faces etched with disbelief. Neighbors brought food and lanterns, hoping the boys would emerge from the woods at any moment. Yet as the sun dipped once more behind the trees, the hope of an easy explanation began to crumble. What began as a fishing trip had transformed into a nightmare. The clues suggested interruption, yet no clear answers. The silence of the creek grew unbearable, as if it carried secrets it refused to share. The disappearance of Jake Harris and Tommy Wilson was no longer a private family worry. It had become a mystery that would grip Baldwin County and test its investigators for decades to come. And as that first long night turned into the second, searchers realized they were chasing shadows. The boys were gone. The creek had swallowed them, or something far worse had happened. The case had only just begun, but the darkness around Perdido Creek already held its grip tight. Sheriff Harold Bennett stood at the muddy bank of Perdido Creek, his boots sinking into the soft ground. The rising sun revealed the eerie stillness of the abandoned truck and the scattered gear. He had seen accidents, drownings, and even violent crimes in Baldwin County, but something about this scene unsettled him. Two boys did not simply vanish without leaving a trace. By mid-morning, Bennett had mobilized nearly every available deputy. The woods echoed with the sound of officers calling the cousins' names. Search dogs strained at their leashes, their paws leaving marks along the creek. Helicopters thundered overhead, circling the tree line, their searchlights sweeping across open fields. Boats combed the slow-moving water, while divers submerged themselves into the dark current, feeling blindly along the riverbed. Every hour seemed urgent. The first day of a disappearance was critical, and Bennett knew it. He ordered deputies to extend the search beyond the creek, checking dirt roads, abandoned barns, and hunting cabins hidden deep in the pines. Volunteers from town joined in, carrying flashlights and lanterns into the night. Despite the massive effort, there was no sign of Jake or Tommy. Detectives began interviewing anyone who had been near the creek the night before. Fishermen were questioned. Locals who drove the back roads were stopped and asked what they had seen. Some remembered hearing laughter around dusk. Others swore they saw headlights leaving the creek long after midnight, though no one could confirm if it was Jake's truck or another vehicle entirely. Inside the sheriff's office, theories multiplied quickly. Some investigators leaned toward accidental drowning. The footprints leading to the water supported that idea, but the absence of bodies puzzled them. Drownings usually revealed victims within hours, not days. Another theory suggested the boys had run away. But to where? Their truck, gear, and personal belongings were still at the scene. Both families insisted the cousins had no reason to leave home. They were happy, rooted in their community, with no signs of rebellion. The darker possibility lingered in the back of everyone's mind. Foul play. Had someone been waiting in the woods? Was there a confrontation that turned violent? Sheriff Bennett did not say it aloud during those first hours, but the evidence pointed towards something more sinister than an accident. For a week, the investigation consumed the county. Daily briefings were held, and officers scoured the area with increasing desperation. Tips poured in. A suspicious man spotted at a nearby gas station, a stranger camping by the river. Even rumors of an argument overheard near the creek. Each lead was pursued, but none provided answers. Bennett drove home late at night, only to return before dawn. He carried the weight of 2 missing boys and a community demanding answers. He stared at maps, retraced the cousin's final hours, and searched for details he might have missed. But every road led back to the same unsettling truth. Jake and Tommy had disappeared as if the earth itself had swallowed them. By the end of the first week, frustration was mounting. Deputies were exhausted. Families grew restless, torn between hope and fear. The creek, once a place of calm and routine, had become a symbol of dread. Theories remained theories, and evidence remained thin. The search was wide, but the answers were nowhere in sight. And as the days slipped by, Sheriff Bennett began to fear what he could not yet say aloud, that this case would not be solved quickly, and the truth of that night might be buried much deeper than anyone imagined. Grief does not strike quietly. It echoes through every home, every street, and every gathering place. When word spread that Jake Harris and Tommy Wilson had vanished, Perdido Creek was no longer just a fishing spot. It became the place where hope and fear collided. Jake's mother, Linda Harris, stood on her front porch each morning, staring down the road as if her son might suddenly appear with his fishing rod slung over his shoulder. She refused to believe he was gone. In her hand, she held a photograph of Jake in his baseball uniform, smiling shyly at the camera. Neighbors who stopped by saw the pain in her eyes. She told them again and again, "My boy is coming home. He has to." Across town, the Wilson household carried a heavier storm. Tommy's father, Rick Wilson, grew impatient with the lack of answers. A hard-working mechanic, Rick was not a man who sat still. He drove to the sheriff's office daily, demanding updates, questioning every theory, and pressing deputies to do more. His frustration was not anger alone. It was fear clawing at him, fear that no one was moving fast enough to bring his son back. As days stretched into weeks, the families leaned on the community for strength. Local churches opened their doors each evening for prayer vigils. Candles flickered in pews, casting shadows that seemed to bow in sorrow. Pastors spoke of faith, urging everyone not to surrender hope. Hymns filled the air, voices trembling but strong, as if singing might somehow guide the boys back home. In gas stations and diners, the faces of Jake and Tommy stared from posters taped to glass doors and bulletin boards. Their photos became impossible to ignore. 2 teenage boys smiling innocently, their future stolen by an unanswered question. Volunteers drove across rural Alabama, stapling those posters to telephone poles and fence posts. At night, headlights lit up rows of them like silent witnesses along the highways. Classmates from Perdido High School gathered in the gymnasium, clutching each other as they shared memories. Some spoke about Jake's steady presence on the baseball field. Others recalled Tommy's laughter echoing in the hallways. Their desks sat empty now, but students decorated them with flowers, notes, and baseball caps, turning them into quiet shrines. Teachers found it hard to continue lessons. The weight of absence hung too heavily over the school. For the entire town, life seemed to slow down. Work carried on. Fields were tended and shops opened their doors, but there was a constant hush, a sense that every action was incomplete without the boys' return. Parents held their children a little tighter, reminded that safety was never promised. Yet, despite the sorrow, a flame of unity grew stronger. Families who barely knew each other shared meals. Farmers donated food to feed search volunteers. Strangers offered prayers for 2 boys whose story had now become everyone's burden. Still, under that unity lay a quiet terror, the mystery of how 2 cousins could disappear without a trace. And as the vigils continued, so did the gnawing question, was this the work of fate, or had someone in the shadows taken Jake and Tommy away? The community refused to let the story fade, but with every passing day, the silence around Perdido Creek deepened, and that silence carried a chilling weight that no prayer could lift. In the weeks after Jake Harris and Tommy Wilson vanished, hope clung to every rumor. Any whisper, no matter how thin, was treated like a lifeline. But those whispers often led investigators down roads that ended in silence. One of the first stories came from a fisherman who claimed he saw a drifter near Perdido Creek on the night of July 14th. The man was described as tall, wearing a torn jacket despite the heat. He had been spotted sitting on the bank, smoking a cigarette and staring into the water. Deputies scoured the woods, set up roadblocks, and circulated sketches to nearby towns. For a moment, the community believed the mystery man might hold the key. But days later, the drifter was found sleeping behind an abandoned barn 30 miles away. He had no connection to the boys, and his only crime was trespassing. The lead dissolved into nothing. Not long after, attention turned to a small gas station off Highway 29. Several customers reported seeing strangers there the same evening Jake and Tommy disappeared. Witnesses remembered two men in a beat-up sedan, one pacing near the pumps, the other buying beer inside. Their faces were unfamiliar, and their behavior seemed restless. Detectives pulled security footage, hoping to confirm the story. But the grainy tape revealed nothing unusual, just tired travelers passing through. Once again, the trail that seemed promising faded away. Rumors then spread of drug activity near the creek. A few locals whispered that the area was being used as a hidden exchange point, and perhaps the boys had stumbled into something dangerous. The sheriff's office sent undercover deputies into rural bars, chasing stories of dealers and late-night transactions. But every supposed witness either denied knowledge or provided conflicting details. No names, no arrests, no evidence. The theory lingered in conversations, but investigators could not anchor it to reality. As summer turned to fall, the list of suspects grew only in shadows. Local teenagers became targets of suspicion, questioned again and again by police. Some admitted they had been out near the creek that night, drinking and playing music, but none of their stories matched the timeline. Parents grew uneasy as deputies kept circling back, dragging their sons and daughters into interview rooms. Each session ended the same way. No proof, no answers, only more frustration. What made the case even more agonizing were the near breakthroughs that collapsed in plain sight. At one point, divers thought they had discovered a piece of clothing beneath the muddy water, a faded shirt snagged against a branch. Hope soared, but when it was retrieved, it turned out to be nothing more than a ragged towel, long forgotten by a camper. Another time, search dogs picked up a scent leading deep into the woods, and deputies followed with pounding hearts. Hours later, the trail ended at a dead hollow where nothing but pine needles and silence remained. The more dead ends they reached, the more the weight of time pressed against the investigation. Sheriff Harold Bennett held nightly meetings, mapping out every tip with colored pens, but the board became cluttered with unanswered questions. Deputies drove hundreds of miles following leads phoned in by well-meaning strangers. A truck scene on a bridge, a man camping in the forest, a group of hunters reporting laughter in the distance. Each clue carried the promise of resolution, but none held truth. For the families, every false lead was a cruel game of hope and heartbreak. Linda Harris clung to each rumor as if it might deliver her son back home, while Rick Wilson's patience wore thinner with every collapse. The community, once united in prayer and action, began to feel the cracks of frustration. Conversations at the diner turned from sympathy to suspicion. Neighbors questioned each other quietly, wondering if the answer was not miles away, but hiding in plain sight. Months bled into seasons, and the case that once consumed headlines began to wither under the weight of uncertainty. Still, the whispers never stopped. Every shadowed figure, every unfamiliar car, every distant noise became a possible clue. But the harder investigators chased the phantom suspect, the more the truth slipped through their fingers. And as winter crept closer, one haunting question echoed louder than ever. Were Jake and Tommy hidden by strangers passing through, or had the danger been closer to home all along? By the end of 1996, the noise around Jake Harris and Tommy Wilson's disappearance had dimmed to a painful quiet. The search teams no longer gathered at dawn. The sheriff's office no longer sent helicopters over Perdido Creek. The maps once covered in colored pins were rolled up and stored away. What remained was a case file, thick with reports and interviews, left to gather dust in the back of the evidence room. Detectives, once consumed by the urgency of the mystery, were reassigned to new crimes demanding their attention. Fresh robberies, assaults, and burglaries filled their schedules, while Jake and Tommy's names appeared less and less in daily briefings. Sheriff Harold Bennett promised the families the case was still open, but everyone knew the momentum was gone. Leads had dried up, Rumors had faded. The boys were still missing. For the Harris and Wilson families, time did not move the same way. Empty bedrooms stood as frozen memorials. Jake's baseball cap remained on the edge of his dresser, untouched, while his mitt lay stiff with disuse. Tommy's comic book still sat in a stack beside his bed, waiting for a laughter that would never return. Birthdays passed quietly. Candles lit for boys who were not there to blow them out. Holidays became shadows of themselves, gatherings marked by empty chairs and silent prayers. The seasons turned, but grief never loosened its hold. In spring, neighbors plowed their fields while the Harris family planted flowers by Jake's window. In summer, when cicadas buzzed in the humid air, Rick Wilson sat on his porch, staring at the fading posters still taped to a nearby gas station wall. Autumn brought football games and school dances that the boys should have attended. Winter laid a cold silence across the town, a silence broken only by the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings. Some in the community tried to move forward. People stopped speaking of the cases often, not out of indifference, but from exhaustion. It was easier to bury the questions than to live with them every day. Yet, for the families, moving forward was impossible. Each year, without answers, only deepened the wound. Linda Harris continued to visit the creek, standing on the muddy bank where Jake's truck had been found. She whispered her son's name into the wind, hoping it might reach him somehow. Rick Wilson grew harder, his frustration carving lines into his face. He visited the sheriff's office less often, no longer demanding daily updates. He had learned the painful truth that the silence had won. What he carried now was not hope, but hollow endurance. By the turn of the millennium, the case was little more than a fading memory in official records. A file, a handful of photographs, and a few broken theories. But for those who loved Jake and Tommy, time did not erase the loss. Every sunrise without them was another reminder of the night that stole their futures. And beneath the surface of the silence, one unshakable truth lingered. Somewhere, someone knew what had happened to the boys. The years had buried the evidence, but not the secret. In the summer of 2018, a new detective arrived at the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office. Detective Amy Rodriguez was 34 years old, sharp-eyed, and known for her persistence. She had recently been assigned to review cold cases, and stacked among the boxes waiting for her was a file marked Harris and Wilson, 1995. Most detectives had stopped opening that file years ago. To many, it was an unsolvable mystery, a black hole that swallowed time and energy. But Amy did not see the case as a relic. She saw it as unfinished work, an unanswered question that still haunted two families. For weeks, she pored over reports, photographs, and evidence logs. She studied crime scene notes that described the truck by Perdido Creek, the scattered gear, and the muddy footprints fading into the water. It was the fishing equipment that drew her attention. Among the listed items was a single rod, marked with a faint stain near the handle. The original report mentioned it only briefly, noting that substance may be rust or mud. In 1995, technology had not been able to test such a small trace. Amy requested the rod from the evidence locker. When she held it under the fluorescent light, her instincts sharpened. The stain was dark, not the color of mud, and it had hardened into the ridges of the handle. It had been there all along, overlooked, dismissed, and left to sit untouched for 23 years. She sent the rod to the state crime lab with a request for advanced testing. Modern forensic science had advanced beyond what investigators in 1995 could have imagined. Even the smallest trace of blood, preserved for decades, could now yield a DNA profile. Weeks passed in tense silence, but Amy kept revisiting the file, reviewing the timeline, and building a list of anyone ever questioned in the case. Then, one morning, the email arrived. The results were in. The dried stain on the fishing rod was not mud. It was blood, and it did not belong to Jake Harris or Tommy Wilson. The DNA matched someone else entirely, a man named Robert Bobby Kincaid. Kincaid had been 22 years old at the time of the boys' disappearance. He was known around town as a troubled figure, a drifter who worked odd jobs and spent long nights drinking near the creek. Early in the investigation, he had been questioned briefly, but no evidence linked him directly to the crime. Without proof, He had slipped back into the shadows, his name fading into the sea of rumors. Now, 23 years later, his blood had surfaced in the past, clinging to the handle of a fishing rod once gripped by two teenage cousins. The revelation sent a jolt through the sheriff's office. Files were pulled back from storage. Old interview transcripts were reread. For the first time in decades, the case had a name, a living suspect, and a path forward. For Amy Rodriguez, it was more than just a breakthrough. It was a confirmation that patience and detail could cut through years of silence. The forgotten fishing rod had spoken, and its message was clear. Jake and Tommy's story was not finished. But as investigators turned their focus to Bobby Kincaid, they realized that unearthing the truth after so many years would not be simple. The DNA was a key, but the door it opened led to darker questions, and a man who had built his life on secrets. The silence of 23 years had finally cracked. What waited beyond was a confrontation that would shake the entire community. Detective Amy Rodriguez could not let the fishing rod go. The DNA match had given her a suspect, but in her mind it was only the beginning. She reopened every page of the file, studying notes with fresh eyes. The names of witnesses, the faded photographs, even the smallest scribbled remarks became pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. Her days stretched late into the night. She called retired deputies, tracked down locals who had moved away, and requested boxes of evidence from off-site storage. She wanted to know everything about Robert Bobby Kincaid. The more she uncovered, the more unsettling the picture became. Kincaid had a history of violence that was rarely documented but widely whispered about. In his early 20s, he had been arrested for bar fights, each incident dismissed as drunken outbursts. Women he dated spoke of his temper, his unpredictable moods, and nights when he disappeared without explanation. He had grown up just a few miles from Perdido Creek and often spent nights fishing or camping near the water. Amy interviewed men who had once shared those nights with him. They recalled that Kincaid could be friendly one moment and explosive the next. One remembered him smashing a bottle against a tree in sudden rage. Another recalled that Kincaid always carried a hunting knife clipped to his belt, even when there was no reason for it. The details, once overlooked, now formed a chilling pattern. Rodriguez went further. She pulled employment records, discovering that in the summer of 1995, Kincaid had been working at a mechanic shop near the gas station where the cousins were last rumored to be seen. She tracked down the shop owner, who admitted he had always found Kincaid strange, often disappearing for hours without notice. Each discovery fed her determination. What had once been a case buried in silence now burned like a fresh wound. She thought about the Harris and Wilson families, about the empty bedrooms that still stood untouched after 2 decades. Their decades of waiting mirrored her own growing obsession. She could not walk away, not when the pieces were finally coming together. Her colleagues noticed a change. They saw her office light on long after others had gone home. They saw the maps pinned to her wall, red lines tracing Kincaid's movements, dates marked in heavy ink. She spoke little of other cases. Her focus narrowed to one name, one face, one night in July 1995. For Amy Rodriguez, this was no longer just about solving a cold case. It was about restoring voices to the silenced and proving that even 23 years of dust could not bury the truth. But as she closed in on Kincaid, she knew that obsession alone would not be enough. To prove guilt, she needed more than patterns and whispers. She needed a confession, or evidence that could not be denied. And somewhere in Kincaid's past, hidden beneath layers of lies, that final piece of proof was waiting. Robert Bobby. Kincaid was 47 years old when detectives knocked on his door. Time had not softened him. His frame was thick, his face weathered by years of sun and hard work, but his eyes still carried the same restless intensity people remember from his youth. He had built a quiet life in the county, keeping to himself, avoiding attention. When Detective Amy Rodriguez introduced herself and asked him to come down to the sheriff's office for a conversation, he agreed with a shrug. Inside the small, windowless interrogation room, the tension was heavy from the start. Kincaid leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing a smirk that hinted at annoyance rather than fear. Amy began calmly, asking him to recall where he had been on the night of July 14th, 1995. He shifted, his answers vague. Probably home, he muttered. It has been 23 years. Who remembers that long ago? At first, it seemed like a familiar dance, an old suspect, brushing off old questions. But Amy had come prepared. After an hour of circling questions, she slid a folder across the table. Inside were the lab reports, the DNA profile, and the match. She spoke slowly, each word measured. Bobby, the blood on that fishing rod was yours. For the first time, his composure cracked. The smirk faded. His jaw tightened. He leaned forward, staring at the papers as though he could will them into being false. Silence hung in the room, broken only by the steady hum of the overhead light. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower, rougher. I never meant for it to happen, he said. Amy did not rush him. She waited, and then the story spilled out. He told him that on that July night, he had been drinking by Perdido Creek. It was his place, a spot he claimed as his own. When Jake and Tommy arrived, setting up their gear near the bank, he confronted them. He said he shouted at them, accused them of trespassing, of ruining his night. The boys, startled but unafraid, argued back. Tommy, always the braver of the two, made a remark that cut through Kincaid's drunken haze like a spark to dry grass. Rage overtook him. He admitted that he swung at Tommy first. The scuffle quick and brutal. Jake tried to pull his cousin back, but the struggle grew chaotic. At some point, the fishing rod snapped, the sharp edge cutting into Kincaid's hand. The blood that stained the handle had been his. He described how panic set in as the boys fell silent on the muddy bank. He never used the word murder. Instead, he spoke in fragments, circling his guilt but never naming it fully. He said he dragged their bodies into the water, weighed down by rocks. He scattered their belongings, overturned the tackle box, and left the truck's lights on, hoping it would look like an accident. Every detail came with a chilling detachment. His words painted the creek as a grave, the summer night as a crime scene cloaked in darkness. Amy listened, her pen still, her eyes locked on his. When the confession ended, Kincaid leaned back, breathing heavily, as though the burden of silence had finally slipped. The room was quiet again, but it was no longer the quiet of denial. It was a quiet of truth, raw and undeniable. The case that had haunted two families for 23 years had found its voice. In the broken words of a man who had thought his secret would remain buried forever. But a confession was only the beginning. Ahead waited the arrest, the trial, and the weight of justice pressing down on a community that had carried sorrow for far too long. The morning of September 2018 was quiet in rural Baldwin County. But that quiet did not last. Patrol cars rolled down the gravel drive of Robert Bobby, Kincaid's home, lights flashing against the faded paint of his porch. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as deputies stepped out, their voices firm and deliberate. Within minutes, Kincaid was in handcuffs, his head bowed, his body slouched under the weight of a crime buried for more than 2 decades. The news spread fast. By noon, every diner and gas station in town was buzzing with the same words. They finally arrested someone for Jake and Tommy. People who had lived through the summer of 1995 felt a shock run through them. The wound they had carried silently for years reopened, raw and tender. For some, it brought anger. For others, relief. For all, it was a reminder that time could not erase tragedy. Jake's mother, Linda Harris, sat in her living room when a deputy delivered the call. She clutched the phone tightly, tears sliding down her cheeks. For 23 years, she had prayed for a day like this. Yet the joy was tangled with sorrow, because the answer she had begged for also confirmed the nightmare she had feared. Her son had not run away. He had not simply vanished. He had been taken from her. Tommy's father, Rick Wilson, reacted differently. He clenched his fists, pacing the floor as he listened to the update. His grief, once hardened into silence, now erupted into anger. He told reporters outside his home, "It took half my life, but they cannot run from the truth forever." His voice cracked as he added, "My boy mattered. Both of them mattered." Court hearings began within weeks. Families who had once been young parents now walked into the courthouse with gray in their hair, their faces lined by decades of waiting. They sat side by side, the Harris and Wilson families, carrying photographs of Jake and Tommy. The photographs, once bright with youth, looked frozen in time against the aging faces of their parents. Inside the courtroom, the community gathered too. Men and women who had once pinned search maps, handed out flyers, and prayed at vigils now filled the benches. Some had moved away years ago, but returned for this moment, drawn back by loyalty and memory. The courthouse steps became a place of reunion, of tears, of long embraces. The whispers that once floated through town, rumors of runaways, of strangers, of impossible theories, fell silent. In their place came unity. The town rallied around the families, recognizing at last the depth of their loss and the endurance of their fight. Churches held special services, dedicating prayers to the boys. Candles burned once more at the steps of the sheriff's office, not as a plea, but as a tribute. As Kincaid sat at the defense table, his expression hardened, refusing eye contact. The contrast was stark. On one side sat a man who had buried his guilt for years. On the other side sat families who had carried grief openly every day for nearly a quarter of a century. For the Harris and Wilson families, justice did not bring their boys back. The bedrooms remained empty, the laughter forever silenced. But the arrest gave them something they'd been denied for so long, an ending, a truth, and a chance to speak their sons' names in court, demanding the world remember. In 2018, Baldwin County closed one of its darkest chapters. The community, scarred but standing together, finally saw justice at last. The case of Jake Harris and Tommy Wilson leaves behind more than a solved mystery. It leaves lessons carved into the fabric of time. For 23 years, silence weighed heavier than words, and yet the families never stopped pushing. Their persistence became the quiet force that kept the boys' memory alive when the world seemed ready to forget. The breakthrough also shows how science can do what human eyes once could not. Forensic advances turn forgotten fishing rod into the key that unlocked the truth. It is a reminder that patience, progress, and determination can breathe life into even the coldest of cases. Above all, it is a story of resilience. On a quiet evening, Linda Harris stands at Perdido Creek. The water flows gently, no longer a place of torment but of peace. She whispers goodbye, her voice trembling yet strong, a farewell carried by the current, at last releasing her son to rest. Justice arrived late, but it arrived. And in that moment, a community learned that truth, no matter how long it hides, can never be erased.